What's up, TUMNAD lectures? In today's video, we are going to be looking at what we call the basics of what we call the cardiovascular system. Please, if you find it helpful at the end of it all, please make sure you like the video, comment down in the comment section, and please subscribe. Please subscribe. Let's go ahead and get started. In this video, we are going to be mainly focusing on this kind of the organisms, and we want to see why we need cardiovascular system in the multicellular organism, and we don't need it here. Now, this kind of organism here is what we call the unicellular organism. Okay, this kind of the organism here is what we call the unicellular organism. Okay, is what we call a unicellular organism. And of course, this kind of the organism here is going to be what we call the multicellular organism. The reason why it is called multicellular organism, you can even also see that it's going to be containing a lot of different kind of the cells that make up that kind of the organism. Now, this unicellular organism is called unicellular just simply because it's just made up of a single cell, okay? Just a single celled organism. And the classic example I'm going to be using is this kind of the organism, which we are going to be calling the Amoeba, okay? I'm going to be using this kind of the unicellular organism, which we are calling the Amoeba. However, we have a lot of these kind of the unicellular organisms, like the paramecium, also have what we call the bacteria. All those are single cell organisms, okay? And then when we come to this kind of the multicellular kind of the organism, we're going to be having a lot like the human beings and even also other kind of the mammals, like the cows, like the dogs, like the rats, and all those kind of the organisms, they are going to be having what we call multiple of different kind of the cells. They're going to be having a lot of cells, like for example, millions, billions, and even also trillion of cells. Like a human being has what we call trillions of cells. Okay, so all that one makes a lot of sense. So now we shall be looking at what we call the feeding mechanism of this kind of unicellular organism, how it is different from what we call the multicellular organism. We shall look at what we call the gas exchange, because these two organisms, they need gases, and also we need what we call the expulsion of different kind of the wastes. We shall also talk about the membrane, how the membrane is going to be facilitating the movement of different substances within this cell we are calling the organism, which we are calling the unicellular organism. And then finally, we shall also talk about what we call the transport mechanisms that are going to be helping in the receiving of different kind of the substances for the case of what we call the unicellular organisms, and even also what we call the multicellular organism. Okay. So now, starting off, we are going to be looking at this kind of unicellular organism, which we are calling the Amoeba. So now, this kind of the organism is going to be a single-celled organism. For that reason, it has all the characteristics of what we call the living organisms. Now, this cell, it has to feed, it has to move, he has to survive in an environment. He is sensitive to what we call dangerous stimuli. He is going to be surviving in an environment like any other kind of what we call the multicellular organism. Okay. Now the question is, why is it that we don't need cardiovascular system in this unicellular organism, and we need the cardiovascular system in this kind of the organism? Now, when you look at this kind of the unicellular organism, like the Amoeba, this is going to be the environment where it is going to be living. He survives in an environment just because all what it requires to survive are located within the environment. It's all that simple. If it is having everything it requires, then it can survive in an environment. Now the question is, how is it getting all those kind of the requirements that it requires for it to survive in an environment? Now, this kind of the Amoeba is going to be having this the cell membrane. This cell membrane is going to be very thin. And the advantage of that being very thin is that it's going to be allowing the in movement of all the different kind of the substance that this kind of the Amoeba is going to be in need of. For example, you're going to be having a lot of different substances, like this is going to be like the food substances, okay? And this food has to move. This food has to move to this kind of the Amoeba, such that he can also feed on it for continuous survival. Now the question is, how is this kind of the amoeba, how is it going to be taking in this kind of different substances like food? He has these vaginations on this kind of the membranes. Whenever he senses that this is something to eat, there's something to eat, he folds to make something like what we call the pseudopods. Okay, he makes these kind of the pseudopods that are going to be now surrounding that kind of the prey. Okay, that kind of the food substance. Maybe it could be maybe even a bacteria. So now, when he does that, those kind of the pseudopods, what happens is that he closes. Okay, he closes on one end. By doing that, he has created what we call the food vacuum. Now, he will release a lot of different kind of the enzymes that are going to be breaking this kind of the food substance taken in for continuous survival, and even also all kind of the nutrients that he requires for continuous growth. So now, such a beautiful thing. So now, what happens is that this kind of the amoeba is going to be feeding by that kind of the phagocytic mechanism. Okay. And then another thing is that the environment where this kind of the organism is going to be living, he needs what we call gaseous exchange. He needs oxygen that's going to be used in running some other kind of the physiological processes, and then he will release a lot of different substances as wastes. Now, what is very beautiful that favor this kind of the amoeba to survive in an environment is that all of its kind of the membrane is serving as exchange surface. That is something which is very beautiful. And besides that, the surface area to the volume ratio in unicellular organisms is going to be super very large. And that is why it's going to be very easy for these kind of the substances that are all over its environment to enter inside this kind of the amoeba. It is such a beautiful thing. So now we're going to be seeing a lot of different substances entering, okay, entering this kind of the cell through what we call the membrane. Okay, they are going to be entering throughout the membrane, because we have said that this membrane, we said that is very thin. It is allowing different kind of the substances that this kind of the amoeba required to survive just to enter by simple diffusion. Okay, so we are going to be seeing simple diffusion of the substances entering into this kind of the unicellular organism. We're also going to be having osmosis, because this kind of the organism is going to be in need of water to run other different kind of the processes. So now, like for example, we're going to be using what we call osmosis, the movement of water from low solute concentration to high solute concentration. However, it has a lot of the mechanisms that in case there is too much water that enters it, it shouldn't overswell and then burst. It has mechanism to push out excess water such that it ensures homeostasis to continuously survive in an environment. Okay. Besides that, following the usage of the nutrients, the oxygen, he is going to be releasing a lot of the wastes. Because if the waste remains inside this kind of the amoeba, the homeostasis will not be ensured. Now the question is, how is this amoeba, how is it going to be eliminating the wastes? It is all very simple. The membrane does it all. Okay, what happens is that the wastes are going to start now moving out, just passing out on what we call the membranes. Okay, so now the waste will start moving out of this organism we are calling the amoeba. Okay, so now that is why we are saying that this kind of the membrane is going to be acting as exchange surface for this kind of the unicellular organism we are calling the amoeba, and even also some other kind of other unicellular organisms. So now, by doing that, these kind of the mechanism that helps it transport substances in and out of this cell are enough for it to survive in an environment. For that reason, he doesn't need all that modified kind of the circulatory system that which is going to be in what we call multicellular organism. Okay? Now, the following are going to be some of the transport mechanisms that are going to be helping this kind of the organism to get all the required substances and even also to pass out what we call the wastes. Is going to be using what we call passive diffusion. Okay, what we call passive diffusion. It is also going to be using some of the substances are going to be moving down their concentration gradient. And of course, that's going to be what we call the passive diffusion. Now, we also have some of the kind of the substances that it needs, which requires energy. In that way, it is going to be now moving by active process. So we also have what we call active transport. Okay, we also have what we call active transport. We also have what we call osmosis. Okay. Besides that, we may even have some little bit of what we call facilitated diffusion. Okay. So now those are some of the mechanisms that this amoeba is going to be using to, to take in different substances and even also to push out some of the waste after it has utilized those kind of the nutrients. Okay, so now that one makes a lot of sense. By only using these mechanisms, it is enough for this kind of the unicellular organism to survive in an environment. It's such a beautiful thing. So now, when we come over to this kind of a multicellular organism, we said that a classic example we are going to be using like the humans. Okay, we are going to be using a classic example like the humans. Now, the human is going to be a very big kind of the structure having trillions of cells. Now, this kind of the multicellular organism, we want to see can only simple diffusion be sufficient enough to feed all the required kind of the substances to this kind of the multicellular organism? The answer is no. Simple diffusion cannot provide all the required substances for this multicellular organism to survive. Okay? It means we need some other kind of the mechanisms that is going to be transporting all the required kind of the substances to reach all these kind of the cells to perform their own physiological processes for continuous survival of what we call this multicellular organism like the humans. Besides that, these multicellular organisms, like we human beings, we are metabolically active. We need to move to look for the survival. So now all those processes which are going to be doing us as human beings requires a lot of energy. Besides that, we are going to be producing a lot of waste which are going to be toxic. In that way, we need that kind of the transport mechanism that's going to be bringing the nutrients and then removes what we call the waste into what we call the environment, and that one would facilitate our survival in what we call in the environment. Okay, now let's first pay much attention on this multicellular organism and see why is it that we need an advanced kind of the transport mechanism which we are calling the cardiovascular system. Okay, now on this kind of the multicellular organism like a human being, it was designed with specific types of the structures, and these structures are constantly providing us one of the most important kind of the nutrients, some of the most important kind of the gases that are going to be helping in the normal physiological running of the human being. It's such a beautiful thing because if this kind of these structures stop, it means a human being cannot survive. Okay? Now, we have these beautiful structures here. Within this kind of the multicellular organism, we have some of the cells, some of the tissues that are going to be making this beautiful kind of the structure. You know how this structure is called? This structure here is what we call the lungs. Okay, this structure here is what we call the lungs. Now, these lungs, they are always bringing in oxygen. It means that as oxygen enters through this structure we are calling the lungs, we shall have somewhere where we are going to be having exchange surfaces between these gases with some other kind of the structure, because we need to know when this oxygen enters through this kind of the lungs, where is it going to go? Okay, where is it going to go? It means it is going to be moving into specific type of the structures which I'm about to talk about. Okay, it is such a beautiful thing. So now we are going to be getting a lot of oxygen through this kind of the lungs. We also need to take in substances like food, like water, for continuous growth, because one of the characteristics of a living thing that it has to grow, but it grows by feeding. So now we also have a specific type of the structure within this kind of the multicellular organism that is responsible for bringing in the different types of the nutrients that are going to be taken inside, and then they finally move to what we call the small intestine. We are going to be now having exchange of these nutrients coming from the lumen, the gastrointestinal lumen. They enter into this tube as I'm about to talk about. Okay, so that means here we are going to be having exchange. Okay, we're going to be having exchange as the nutrients are going to be moving from this kind of the gastric tube, which are calling the small intestine tube, into this kind of this big kind of this tube. Now, what happened is that if it wasn't this kind of this big tube, it means these nutrients and even the gases wouldn't be able to move from the site of entry up to where it is going to be required. Okay? Now, we said we also have oxygen gas, which is going to be coming from this structure you're calling the lungs. They also need to be exchanged here, okay, as they enter into this kind of this tube with exchange of other kind of the gas, which I'll talk about later once oxygen has been fully utilized by what we call the tissues. Now, coming back on these kind of these tissues, when you compare the surface area to volume ratio between this unicellular organism and this multicellular organism, you realize that at the surface area to volume ratio in multicellular organism is going to be low compared to what we call unicellular organism. It's such a beautiful thing. So now, let's assume that this is going to be not a realistic kind of the anatomical diagram, but it's going to be now trying to show you how exactly the cardiovascular is very essential in multicellular kind of the organisms. Now, let's assume that it is this kind of these outer kind of these cells that are going to be exposed to the environment. Let's just pretend that these are the only cells that are going to be exposed into the environment. And let's say that they have the ability to take in different kind of the substances and even also to excrete different kind of the substances to the environment. Let's first pretend for these outer kind of the cells. Now, if they are all surviving by those kind of the simple kind of the mechanisms, now how about these cells that are going to be deep inside of this kind of these multicellular cells? Because for this multicellular organism to work efficiently, to work as a whole, all of these kind of these cells, no matter the distance they are from the environment, they also need to get the required kind of the substances for their continuous survival. It's such a beautiful thing. So now what happens is that these cells that are deeply embedded inside this kind of the multicellular organism, how is it going to be getting the required substances? Okay, so now, because it also requires nutrients, it also requires oxygen and all other kind of the substances, it means that this kind of the organism should have that kind of the mechanism of delivering the required substances to these kind of these cells that are deeply embedded within it. It makes a lot of sense. Now, what happens is that once there's nutrients that have entered in this kind of this big kind of this tube, okay, we also have a specific type of the liquid that is going to be running inside this kind of this tube. This kind of the liquid which is going to be running inside this kind of these tubes, it has to be with that kind of the ability to either dissolve the substances like oxygen, and even also to either suspend some other substances like for example like what we call the nutrients. Okay, now what happens is that let's say that we have gotten this kind of the liquid, it has dissolved or it has suspended some of the substances that needs to be transported to even these deeper kind of the cells. Now the question is, how are these deeper cells, how are they going to be getting the required substances? We are going to be having a lot of this kind of this fluid, okay, this kind of this fluid which is going to be moving inside this kind of these tubes, okay, this kind of this fluid which is going to be moving inside this kind of these tubes, meaning that this liquid is going to be suspending or dissolving the different substances, and then they move it until they reach that kind of final the cell that requires it most. Okay, now what happens is that within these tubes we are going to be having a network of different kind of the tubes that are going to be dividing into different kind of the branches to make sure that even that cell that is deep inside also gets what it requires. How is it going to be happening exactly? Now we are going to be having these kind of the tubes that are going to be moving inside like this, and then they finally take these kind of the nutrients, and then the nutrients should even reach these inner kind of these cells. So we're also going to be having also the nutrients also moving in the same pattern, and then they unite, and then they also feed all these kind of these cells that are going to be deeply embedded inside these kind of these cells. Okay, so now we are seeing that we also have these kind of these tubes that are going to be moving throughout these kind of these cells to make sure that even the cells that are deeply buried inside, they also get the all kind of the required substances for their continuous kind of the survival. So now through this kind of the mechanism, by the use of these tubes, you realize that even these deeper embedded cells, they can also get the required kind of the substances. Okay, they can also get the required kind of the substances. Okay, they can also get the required kind of the substances for their continuous survival in what we call as a whole, as a multicellular organism. Okay, so now through this kind of the mechanism, these kind of the cells bedded inside can also get the mechanism. Now, for continuous movement of this liquid inside within these tubes, we made a specific type of the pump that is going to be applying a specific type of the pressure that will move this kind of the substances within this kind of the tubes at a normal kind of the pressure that will be aiming at meeting the demands of this kind of these cells. Okay, so now because this fluid, without that kind of the pressure, it will not be moving to what we call to different kind of the cells. For that reason, this kind of the multicellular organism was designed with specific type of the pump that applies pressure to make sure that that liquid which is in the tubes moves the kind of the nutrients and other gases to the site that is going to be utilized by the different types of the cells. It is such a beautiful thing. Now, we have this kind of this pump here. This pump is going to be generating a sufficient amount of the pressure that will move this kind of the liquid to drive all the nutrients to the different kind of the cells that are deeply buried inside this kind of the organism. Okay, so now we also have here this structure here which we are calling the pump. Okay, so now we have the pump, we have even also the tubes, and even also we're also going to be having this kind of this liquid which is going to be helping in the movement of different substances. Now, this liquid which is going to be helping in the movement of different substances, when dissolved in it or suspended in it, it is what we call the mass transport media. Okay, is what we call the mass transport medium. Okay, all the nutrients, the gas are going to be dissolved or suspended in this kind of liquid, and they are transported to different kind of the cells for their kind of the metabolic needs. Okay, but this kind of the transport medium is not only going to be transporting the nutrient and the gas, but it also has to drive some other kind of the substances that has to leave these cells after they have utilized all the nutrients. What happens is that when these cells have used up the nutrients and even also what we call the gases, they are going to be releasing a lot of different kind of the wastes. Okay, we need to see how the wastes are going to be leaving this kind of the multicellular organism. We have this kind of the specific kind of the tubes that are going to be moving throughout this kind of the multicellular organism, collecting all the kind of the waste that have been produced by this kind of the cell. So now once these cells produce the waste, they are going to be now entering through this kind of these tubes, okay, such that they are going to be removed from what we call this kind of the cells. So now it means that this kind of the mass transport medium, it also has to move and drive off all these kind of the waste to their site of what we call excretion. Okay, so now in that way, this kind of the mass transport medium will drive some of this kind of the waste in this kind of this structure we are calling the kidney, and then some of the waste can be like, for example, urea, excess water, the drugs can also get eliminated through this kind of this structure we are calling the kidney. Okay, it makes a lot of sense. By doing that, this fluid passing through the kidney, it's going to be allowing the exit of different kind of the substances. Besides that, these kind of other substances, the waste, like for example carbon dioxide, will have to move and come to this kind of this pump, of which this pump will push it to other kind of the structure where it's going to be popped out. So now when this kind of the waste like carbon dioxide reaches on this structure we are calling the lungs, this kind of the carbon dioxide is going to be now moving out through this kind of this structure, such that because if this carbon dioxide doesn't move out, it will make the blood become super acidic, which will stop some other physiological processes running inside this multicellular organism. Okay, so now all that one makes a lot of sense. Okay, so now this kind of the system, which is going to be containing a pump, it is containing this kind of the tubes, and even also it is containing this kind of the substance which we are calling the mass transport media. This kind of the system is what we call the cardiovascular system. Okay, so now what are the components of cardiovascular system? Now, components of cardiovascular system. Components. Now, the first component is going to be this kind of this pump. Okay, it is going to be what we call the pump. And then this pump in human beings, it is what we call the heart. Okay, what we call the heart. Okay, and then the second one is going to be these kind of these tubes that are delivering the nutrients, the gases, and even also draining different kind of the wastes to what we call for removal. These kind of the tubes in human beings, they are what we call the blood, what we call the blood vessels. And of course, later we shall go into the detail and see that we have a lot of the blood vessels. We have what we call the arteries, we have what we call the veins, and even also what we call the capillaries. We shall go into the detail of that one later. And then the last one, we also have what we call the mass transport media. Okay, we also have what we call the mass transport medium, or the mass transport liquid. Okay, the mass transport liquid. And in the mammals, this kind of the mass transport liquid or medium is what we call the blood. Okay, is what we call the blood. However, we also have one of the most important components, the structure, which is part of the cardiovascular system, which ensures unidirectional blood flow. And that structure is going to be what we call the valves. They're going to be residing in what we call the heart, and even also what we call the veins. Okay, so now that structure is also very important in what we call cardiovascular system, and that one is what we call the valves. Okay, so now all those components, they make what we call the cardiovascular system. Now the question is, why is cardiovascular system important in multicellular organisms? It is all that simple. The multicellular organism, first of all, is going to be super active. For that reason, it needs sufficient mechanism that will deliver all those kind of required nutrients and oxygen gases at the time they need it most. Besides that, because it is active, it's going to be producing a lot of the toxins and other kind of the waste. We need that kind of transport mechanism that's going to be always sufficient in removing all the different types of the waste. Besides that, we're also going to be seeing that this kind of the multicellular organism is going to be having a small surface area to what we call the volume ratio. So now all those ones explains that why we need this kind of the transport mechanism we are calling the cardiovascular system in this multicellular organism. Even besides that, we have cells that are deep buried inside this kind of the organism. It's not like unicellular organism that is it's just single cell like that. It's just exposed to the environment directly. We have cells that are going to be deeply buried inside, and they also need nutrients, they also need the oxygen gases, and they also need to eliminate their kind of the waste they have produced. So now all that one makes a reason why we need a sufficient mechanism we are calling the cardiovascular system to always provide oxygen, to always provide different kind of the nutrients, and even also to drive away all the kind of the wastes. Okay. So now at TUMNAD, I have talked a lot of things. I hope you guys have enjoyed, and if you have enjoyed, please, you know what to do. You hit the like button, comment down in the comment section, and please subscribe. So now in the next video, we are going to be now looking at the detail of what we call the components of the cardiovascular system, and even also we shall look at what we call the functions played by the cardiovascular system. TUMNAD as always, until we meet next time.